check out the new rigging and animation features in Blender 4.3 and 4.4. The huge news in 4.4 is called slotted actions. In this video, I'll show you exactly how to use slotted actions, and you will see why this update is a big deal in itself, but we'll also talk about how this is just the first step towards something much bigger. Let's dive in. Before we get to slotted actions, however, I'll go over other rigging and animation updates. So let's cover 4.3 quickly, and then we'll move on to 4.4 and slotted actions. My favorite new feature here is the new Eyedropper tool for bone constraints. Let's see how it works. I'll create a new bone, and let's create a second bone. I'll go to constraints, give the selected bone a constraint such as copy rotation, and until now we had this bone picker for the target, but we didn't have the eyedropper tool for the bone field. So we had to choose from this list, which can get really long, but now in 4.3 we have the eyedropper. I can just select it and select the target bone. Okay, a nice but neat feature. Next we have a small update concerning keyframes. If I create an animation for this bone, I'll keyframe it, then go to another keyframe, move it a bit and keyframe it again. And now if I select these keyframes that I already have, and then go in the middle and press I to create a new keyframe, notice that the previously selected keyframes were deselected and only the new keyframe is selected. This behavior brings consistency to Blender's interface. For example, if I have a bunch of objects, select all of them and create a new object, notice how the previously selected objects were deselected and only the new object is selected. So now we have the same behavior for keyframes. The next update concerns motion paths. Let's go to the armature where I already have an animation. I'll go to armature, motion paths, and calculate. And notice how the motion path before the current keyframe is red and everything after the current frame is green. And something we got already in the previous version of Blender is this custom color. I can enable it and set custom colors for this particular path. Okay, but now if I go to Edit, Preferences, Themes, 3D Viewport and scroll down, you'll find new entries for before current frame and after current frame, so I can tweak them here. And this will be the exact colors that I'll see by default for any motion path that I create. Now, there is one more update in 4.3. You'll notice a new field called Animation in some of the properties panels. This new feature kind of ties in with slotted actions, so I'll skip it for now and we'll come back to it in a bit. Quick announcement. I'm about to release a new free course on manual rigging. If you want to learn rigging and if you want to get notified, subscribe to CG Dive with the all option. Okay, now I am in Blender 4.4 and yes, it features the new slotted actions, but first let's get a couple of smaller updates out of the way. They are cool and worth knowing about. There is a small update concerning object constraints. So if I create an object and give it an object constraint, not a bone constraint, previously Blender used to draw a relationship line from the object to the center of the world when there was no target, which was logical but not very useful. So now this line will not be drawn anymore and we'll only see the relationship line when the constraint is fully set up. The next update, or rather a bug fix, concerns the modifiers in the graph editor. So let me insert the keyframe for this cube, for example. Switch to the graph editor. And let's focus on the X location curve, for example. And now I can go to modifiers and give it a noise modifier. And here you'll notice a couple of new fields. We have legacy noise, which will make the noise modifier behave exactly as in previous versions of Blender. But you probably want to keep this off because the whole update was prompted by a bug. It is not a huge bug, but under certain conditions, the noise modifier produced values that didn't make sense. But with this new noise modifier that is fixed, And something else that might interest you is that if you open an old file that contains noise modifiers with Blender 4.4, then these noise modifiers will automatically have the legacy noise checkbox checked, so you'll get the exact same behavior as in your old Blender versions. And that's it, nice and simple. Next, we'll take a look at 2 rigging updates. I'll create a new armature. This update concerns the symmetrization of bone collections that I find here under the armature tab. So to demonstrate, I'll duplicate my default bone and call the new bone bone.l, and let's make another copy and call it other bone.l. So as you know, if I select all of these bones and symmetrize, that will give me bones on the other side called bone.r and other bone.r. But with this update, we can now also symmetrize bone collections. So let's select this bone, press M, and move it to a new collection called bones.l. And this other bone, I'll move to yet another collection and call it other bones.l. Now again, I'll select all bones and pay attention to the bone collections. Right-click, symmetrize, and now I symmetrize not only the bones, but also the collections. The symmetrization of bone collections depends on the exact same conditions as the symmetrization of bones. It is based on the names. So collection bones.l will be symmetrized as bones.r. And .l is what I use, but you can also use _.l, for example, and that will name the right collection in the same way. You can also spell out left fully, like this, symmetrize, and that will give you bones_right. This is a nice new feature, will definitely be useful in rigging. And another nice small update concerning vertex groups and weight painting. Here I have this armature which is controlling this object. And if I go to edit mode and select a vertex, go to the end panel item, here I can directly tweak the vertex weights. And there is this normalize button. And some of the vertex groups for this vertex are locked. Until now, if we had locked vertex groups, the normalize button would have been grayed out. We couldn't use it, but now we can. And so since 002 and 003 are locked, if I normalize, I will only affect the unlocked groups. Personally, I don't use this field much, but if you do, that should be a welcome change. Now let's focus on slotted actions and why there's such a big step forward for Blender's animation system. Slotted actions are the first tangible sign of an overhaul of Blender's animation system. That is something that a small team of Blender developers has been working on for a while. I would like to thank and congratulate them on the work they're doing. We can summarize the benefits of this update in 3 words: improved animation management. The more complex your scene is, the more useful you will find this new system. But to truly understand slotted actions, let's explore how the action system has evolved over the last couple of Blender versions. We'll start in Blender 4.2, which represents the past. In fact, you can go all the way back to 2.8 and actions will behave more or less like this. Here I have a scene with some objects and they don't have any animation data yet. I'm going to switch to Dope Sheet Action Editor and I'll create a little animation for this cone. As soon as I added some keyframes, Blender created a new action labeled Cone Action. The action and the keyframe that we see here mainly concerns the transforms, the location, rotation, and scale of this object. It can also include custom properties, but for the most part, it's the transforms. This object also has a shape key, which I can animate. So I'll give it a keyframe at frame 1, and then animate it at another keyframe. Now the shape key animation was created, but there are no keyframes visible in this action here. That is because the shape key animation is part of a separate mesh action. However, Blender 4.2 and earlier do not give us any direct access to this action. We can still tweak the keyframes by going to the Dope Sheet. In here, I'll find the keyframes for my shape key, and I can manipulate them. I can also do it in the graph editor using the curves and even in the timeline. But for example, I can go to the Dope Sheet Action Editor and I can unlink the transforms action. I can create a new action and so on and so forth. This sort of functionality is completely unavailable for other types of actions, such as shape keys. So let me undo. The only way to unlink the shape key action is to delete all of its keyframes. And it is similar with materials, for example. I can animate this shader, but again, that is not part of an explicit action that I can work with. There is just an implicit action that I can find in the dope sheet. Okay, so for example, if I wanted to synchronize the movement, the shape key, and the material animation, my only option is here in the dope sheet, which is not too bad, but it gets a little bit more complicated when we have two objects interacting. Let's say that I want this object to change its color when it is touched by the other object. So I could keyframe it and give it some animation. Now, for example, if I wanted to tweak the timing of this animation and keep it in sync, I would have to select both objects. That will finally give me access to all of the data. Which is not too bad in this simple scene, but as your scenes get more complex, it can be difficult to select just the right objects. Okay, that's the old system. In Blender 4.3 we got an important update. It's not slotted actions yet, but it's important nonetheless. It is called Action Selectors. In various tabs of the Properties panel, you'll find an Animation panel, and it allows you to create new action and set it and so on. So if I create an animation here, you'll see that the action was created and set in the animation panel. So if I go to Dope Sheet, Action Editor, you'll see that this is exactly the same object level action. So far this can look like just minor convenience. You can set the animation here without going to the Action Editor, but that is not all. If I go to the Data tab, for example, and create a shape key animation, again, we have this animation panel, and you'll see that we have a special shape keys action that was created. I still cannot see it here in the action editor, but now we have explicit control over these actions, which used to be hidden in previous Blender versions. So we have the shape key action, and the mesh action has to do with some of the other mesh settings. For example, the texture space. If I keyframe something, it will create a mesh animation. And similarly, if I go to materials and keyframe any of the shader parameters, that will create an animation for the shader node tree. And the material animation is related to some of the other material properties, such as viewport display, for example. And you'll find similar animation panels in the world tab, for example. So animations for your environment, materials, and textures will go in here. We also have scene animation, and I'm sorry if I'm missing some, but I think these are the main ones. So to summarize, the main thing we got in 4.3 is the ability to set explicit actions for data types that used to be kind of hidden in previous Blender versions. But again, the action editor still only shows object transforms, and it may show some properties. To edit the other stuff, you'll have to go to the dope sheet again, or to graph editor, or timeline, and you'll find the various animation keys here. All right, this is 4.4 with slotted actions. As I said earlier, one of the cool things is that if you don't care about slotted actions, you won't notice them much. I can animate this cone. I can animate its shape key. And material. And it works just as before. But if we scroll down to the animation panel, you'll notice that something indeed has changed. Now for actions, we have these two rows. And the first row is the new type of action, which is actually a container for sub-actions, or slots as they're properly called. And the second row is the actual slot. This may not be technically correct, but the way I imagine it, and it helped me understand how things work, is that the new type of action is just a high-level container for actions. And the slots are what we used to call actions in previous versions of Blender. They contain the actual animation data. In fact, the way I created this animation, I already have an action with slots in it. Let me switch to the dope sheet, action editor, and expand the summary, and you'll see that my object transforms and my shape keys are in the same action. It is cone action, and I have the cone transforms, which I can rename here, and then my shape key action. Now, why were the transforms and shape keys placed in the same action, but the material seems to be placed in another action? I believe that is because, at least currently, Blender is trying to do things as simply and as logically as possible. And because the shape key is definitely part of this particular object's data, that is why the slots were placed in the same action. But a material can be applied to various other objects in the scene, so by default, Blender gives it a separate action. Can we have this material action as part of the cone action? Absolutely yes. Now, currently there is no way that I know to bring this slot into the cone action. I believe tools like this will be coming in the next Blender versions, but for now what I need to do is unlink the action, and before doing any shader animations, set the shader node tree to cone action. That way any shader node tree animation that I create will go into this cone action. Here I can press the new button to create a new slot explicitly, or I can just animate any of the shader tree parameters, and right away I'll see a new slot in the cone action. Okay, this is how I can have the various animation aspects of this cone all in the same action. But this is not limited to a single object. For example, I can also include the animation of this plane here in the same action. The way to do it, of course, is to set your action to cone action in advance. So now I can animate the transforms of this plane. So if I want the plane to move when it is touched by this cone, I can do that right here. And here I have my plane action. And if I want to affect its material in the same action, I'll have to go here, set my shader tree to cone action, and maybe I should name it plane and cone action. And I guess since my action already contained a shader tree animation, it was assigned here. If I wanted to have individual animation for the plane, I'll have to create a new animation. Animate the properties. Okay, so in a nutshell, this is Blender's new way of bringing the animation of multiple things, such as transforms, materials, mesh data, and so on, in the same action. We have a couple of functions to help us manage our actions and slots. They're found under Action. We have Merge Animation, Separate Slots, and Move Slots to a new action. So let's go over them one by one. Currently, I have everything in one action, but if I create a new object and create an animation for it, it will be created in a new action. Now, if I select Suzanne and any of the objects that have the cone action, I can go to Action, Merge Animations. Now, since the cone action was active, the Suzanne slot was added to the cone action. The next operator is Separate Slots. If I click on it, it will split all of our slots into separate actions. So for each slot, we'll get a separate action with just one slot. And this can be useful for backwards compatibility, because you can open a 4.4 blend file into all the Blender versions. The only problem is that if you have actions with multiple slots, then the older Blender version will only see the first slot. So by using separate slots, you will create actions that are backwards compatible. Let me undo. And finally, we have Move Slots to New Action. So for this, I have to select a specific slot by clicking on it. And I could also shift click on multiple slots and then go to Action and move the slots to a new action. So now the plane and the Suzanne slots were combined into this new action. I'm sure we'll get more action and slot tools in the future, but for now, this is what we have. I kept these examples very simple to make the new functions easy to understand. But how are we going to use slotted actions in practice? I'm still discovering this myself, to be honest. I haven't had a whole lot of time to play with them yet. But here is an animation that I worked on in Blender 4.3. In this scene, I have a whole lot of cameras, some empties to control the depth of field. Also, some of the cameras have separate camera data animation, such as field of view, and each of these had to be a separate action until now. But in Blender 4.4, I could just select all of these, go to the action editor, Action, Merge Animation. I'll name this camera animation, and now all of my camera animation and all of the empty animation and camera data animation will be stored in a single action. So one of the big use cases will probably be scene organization. Instead of having hundreds of separate actions, we can now have them logically organized. Now these say legacy slots because I imported this from Blender 4.3. If I had started in 4.4, everything would have been named much nicer and be much easier to work with already. Another area which I believe will be affected positively is rigging. Until now, Blender rigs were special because they were the only type of data which could contain multiple things in the same action. You could have a separate track for each bone. To make use of this, Blender rigs tend to be bloated with a lot of bones. But now that we can store any type of animation data in a single action, this may change how we create and organize our rigs. And another area that I'm very excited about is export. This new type of action will very likely change how we export actions. Until now, it was very difficult to control what will be exported out of your Blender scene. But this new type of slotted action may help us control the export of animations with much more precision. In fact, the GLTF format is definitely being updated to make use of the new action system. And I hope FBX and other formats will follow. But that is something to look forward to. It is not implemented yet in Blender 4.4. If you are already using slotted actions, let me know how in the comments. And as I gather more experience and ideas, I may make another video just about practical uses of this new feature. So slotted actions is a great new feature in itself, but this update is also paving the way for other new features that will come in the near future. The big one to look forward to is a whole new system for animation layering that will improve or maybe even replace the old and somewhat clumsy NLA editor. So there is a lot of development happening under the surface that the developers are not getting enough credit for. So once again, let's appreciate what they're doing and maybe consider donating to the Blender Fund. There are even more updates in 4.4. There are improvements to the pose library. Vulkan is getting more and more stable, which should bring a snappier viewport in the near future. That is great for everyone, but I'm sure the animators among you will be especially excited because it is so much more fun to animate when everything is in real time. If you like this type of video, subscribe with the all option. That way you'll get notified when I cover future Blender animation updates. And you will also get notified when I start releasing my new free rigging course, which I'll start uploading literally in the next couple of days.